So I bring you greetings from Canada, from me and my family. We're quite glad that Albert Lee Seeds has chosen to take our leafy flowery varieties and offer them as part of their silage offering for organic. Maybe we'll start to move into conventional corn silage as well with them in the future. That remains to be seen. I want to give you a little information about my background and length of time in this and experience a little bit. So at university back in the late 60s, I was introduced to corn for the first time. I grew up on a dairy farm, but we never grew any corn, except sweet corn to eat, of course. And so I had a summer job where I was introduced to corn and in plot work, and I really liked corn. So when it came time to find a job coming out of university, I tried to find a job in corn. The job that I could get was one in sales, and so I became territory sales manager for a Canadian company in Central Ontario. And I really liked corn more and more, but I realized that I didn't want to spend my life in sales. I wanted to get into the development of corn varieties. So I went back to the University of Guelph, and is everything coming through okay in terms of, do you want me to be louder? Or?
They're just turning up the volume.
Oh, okay. Well, I can make it louder, but then I get reverb, eh? Yeah. So I went back to graduate school for plant breeding, got a job and started in plant breeding. So my first corn nursery was in 1972, and that now means that I've been through 85 different corn nurseries in my career. I started my own business in 1980, and so since that time I've been through 72 consecutive nurseries. In the first 2 years I was in business, we lost our first 2 winter nurseries in Florida, and then went to Chile and never went back to Florida ever again. So I started with the leafy corn in 1985, and as of last weekend, we have planted our 64th nursery in Chile. That's been constantly our winter production area. Uh-oh. So our symbol says feed corn breeders, and we specialize in corn that would be used on the farm for feed, not corn that would be used to be exported and through the elevator industry and all that. So we specialize for silage in the current lineup of material that we've got. And I'll make just a few statements about working with silage. Feed costs represent 45 to 65% of the total cost of producing milk. Now, let me see by a show of hands, how many of you here are in the dairy industry milking cows? Hands higher, two guys? Oh, well, we could have a private chat then. So you know this already, that feed costs are a major item in terms of what you do. Forages are the most important feed in the dairy ration. Their quality and nutritive value determines the quality of the entire diet, and that's because there's such a massive amount of forages in the diet. When optimal nutrition is achieved, cows will produce better quality and larger quantities of milk. Overall health should improve, resulting in cost savings in veterinary fees, breeding, and treatment with drugs. So this isn't going to be a read it all from the screen thing, but just these first few things. To develop a ration that is cost effective and provides the highest quantity of digestible energy for milk production while maintaining the health of the animals and its rumen microorganisms. So we're hardly not even feeding the cow. What we're doing is feeding the microorganisms in the cow. And this is what's so important in the development of an individual feedstuff and how it fits into a ration. So the goal is to have some money left over and because feed costs are such a huge part of the overall thing, what we're trying to do is maximize income over feed costs. And the quality of that feed is what counts more than almost anything. So plant breeding is both an art and a science, and what we're trying to do is change the traits of the plants to produce desired characteristics. When we're breeding in corn, because corn is an open pollinated system, in the 1880s it was discovered that you could do something to inbreed and make hybrids, and with the first study of genetics, the first hybrids came out in the 1930s. And what I do as a breeder is take variable material, inbreed it for a number of generations, make all my selections in the direction that I want to take the new products that I want to develop, and throw away all the rest. So it's an absolute necessity to be a big trasher in all of this, because if you didn't throw it away, you'd just be inundated. Because if you take 3 inbreds that are unrelated, you can make 6 hybrids to test from the 3 hybrids. But if you take 10 inbreds, you can make 90 hybrids from those. And so it really becomes an absolute terrible thing if you don't throw away a lot of stuff. So we put all of our efforts into trying to breed the parents. And in my graduate work at university had the theory that if we bred the inbred line for yield, that would carry through into the hybrid. I couldn't prove it during that time. I think I've finally proven it after this many years of research. So this depiction shows the inbred plant on the left is a non-leafy plant. The inbred plant on the right is a leafy plant. So the cross between those two makes this leafy hybrid on the this side, and this is actual pictures of one of the 109-day hybrid that Albert Lee is going to be selling now. So over the time and all the experience that I've had with working with silage and testing with silage, and that's been since 1988 when we first started playing with silage, we've come up with these ideal list of characteristics that a silage hybrid should have to be able to make the bells ring in terms of milk production in a ration. And of course, the first thing is strong agronomics. If it doesn't have the ability to produce a good plant and make yield under a lot of different environments, it doesn't make it. It has to have high total plant yield. We have bred for a long harvest window, and I'll explain that in more detail. We've bred for a short storage period, and again, I'll explain that. High starch content, that's pretty easy to understand. High starch digestibility is something that researchers, in terms of nutritional researchers, are only now starting to talk about. Everything was talked about just in terms of starch content before, but high starch digestibility is something that is being talked about now with the success that we're having with different genetics, with Master's Choice starting to talk about this and that sort of thing. High fiber digestibility is something that's been very heavily researched for a very long time. We know a lot about that, and I know how to breed for that quite a bit. Ration type adaptability is the characteristic that a variety should have to be able to feed the different cows on the herd, and we'll talk about that. And then it all adds up to excellent feed quality. So this is a depiction of 2 plants. The one on your left is a grain variety. The one on your right is a typical silage variety that is leafy. And you can see that there's huge differences in terms of plant architecture. And that is the result of the breeding work that I've done with the leafy gene. And I'll explain all about this as we go through. So what is a dual-purpose hybrid? So I know that Albert Lee is selling some dual-purpose hybrids. Every other company is selling dual-purpose hybrids too. And how would we define a dual-purpose hybrid? Well, the first thing is that because there's 90% of the seed sales that there are for grain, it has to be a grain hybrid. And in order to enter the marketplace as a grain hybrid, what must it achieve? Well, it's going to be harvested late in the season as dry grain, as dry as it can be. It's going to have to be combined, go through an elevator process, go to a shipping process some way, whether it's direct from the elevator to an ethanol plant or whatever. And the characteristics of that seed, that is the kernels, the grain that comes off the ear, is that it must be very hard seed. It must be very resistant to breakage. It must be relatively small seed to get the very high test weight. So the farmer who grows the seed is paid on the basis of test weight. They want it to be as dense as possible and to be as dry as possible for the economics of grain production. So that's what a grain hybrid is. And then what would a silage hybrid be in comparison to that? Well, a silage hybrid is something that's going to be harvested much earlier in the season relative to the development of the plant. And you want a product that is going to be fermentable so that it can be stored for a long period of time with the organic acids that are developed in the silo. And then you want it to be digestible in the cow. And we're going to go through quite a bit of the detail of some of this. And they are very opposing characteristics between the two things. So grain hybrid, you want high grain yield. Silage hybrid, you want high total plant yield. Grain is part of that high total plant yield, that's for sure. The kernel moisture on an ideal grain hybrid, you want it to be very dry. The kernel moisture on a silage hybrid, you want it to stay moist. And the reason you want it to stay moist is that it must be moist to be breakable in the silo, or in harvesting and in the silo. The kernel hardness is very hard for the grain hybrid so that it doesn't break. The kernel hardness for a silage hybrid is it should be soft at silage harvest time so that it does break. The kernel size, small, again, to get the very high test weight. In my ideal silage hybrid, I want the kernels to be large so that they get broken easily in the silage harvest process. The stalk moisture in an ideal grain, all grain breeders are breeding for is a very dry ear on a very wet stalk, so a stalk that stays alive as long as possible. And what I breed for in the silage variety is I want the grain to dry more slowly, but I want the stalk to dry more rapidly so that the product comes within the 65% range of harvest moisture and can go into the silo. In terms of stalk, what I've called integrity here, the stalks on a grain hybrid should be as stiff and strong as they can be. There are reasons now that we put plates on the bottom of headers in front of combine tires because these stalks are so strong that they'll wear grooves right in the tires of the combines. For an ideal silage variety, because the stalk encompasses a huge part of the total mass of the silage that we harvest, we want it to be digestible, and so therefore we want it to be as soft as possible. And the ear height on the grain variety is selected to be high. Over my years of breeding, I think the ear height has increased by at least another 18 inches. Part of that is so that you can keep the header up and go like hell in the harvest. Part of it is because by keeping the ear up off the ground, you get better drying rates with the grain that you developed. For the silage variety, I want it to be low, and that relates to fiber digestibility, and I'll explain that in some really good detail in a few minutes here. So what potential problems can occur when you're using a grain hybrid for silage? If we look at my ideal list of things and we say this dual purpose hybrid, what advantages does it have for silage? Well, it certainly has strong economics and it has high total plant yield. But it doesn't have a long harvest window and it doesn't have a short storage period. It can be adapted to several rations, and by adapting to rations, I mean we've got, on the same dairy farm there are heifers, there are early lactation cows, there are mid-lactation cows, there are late lactation cows, there are dry cows, and you need to have different energy supplies for each of those animals. And so a dual-purpose variety can be adapted into all those rations. It doesn't have high fiber digestibility, and by saying it doesn't have high fiber digestibility, certainly it has some fiber digestibility and reasonably good, but there are better things on the market. It does have a high starch content, but it doesn't have high starch digestibility because that starch is very hard. So my conclusion long ago was that dual-purpose hybrids do not make ideal silage, and I've often said that there's no such thing as a dual-purpose hybrid, except that now I'm trying to develop a dual-purpose hybrid that would be for silage and also be for high moisture corn, but that's a very different leaning in terms of its characteristics as well. Come on. So we're going to talk about Leafy then. The Leafy gene has the effect in the plant, so it's a single dominant gene, easy to work with. It has the effect that it disconnects the complete dominance of the development of the tassel over the development of the ear. And by doing that, it allows a breeder to select for more leaves above the ears than you could get with any other what we call normal varieties. So before Leafy was discovered, maximum number of leaves above the ear was 7. You find 7 is the absolute maximum. So if we take 8 as a definition above the ear, that's the way we work. Now, I have in my experience seen leafy plants with as many as 18 leaves above the ear, and they're obviously not usable types. So what we've bred for are types that are 8, 9, 10 leaves above the ear. Now, if they're an average of 10, there might be some odd plants in there that are 11. Leafy always has some variation in it, regardless of the number of generations I've had. Breeding I've put into it, I've never been able to make it absolutely pure in terms of its reaction. Some of the grain producing companies that are trying to sell for silage have often said, well, what difference could those 2 or 3 little leaves at the top of the canopy make in terms of adding extra yield? So I'll go through this illustration with you and show you what that difference is. The grain variety has 6 leaves above the ear. If we very carefully remove the leaves as we come down from the top and compare leaf to leaf, we'll find that the grain variety has those 6 leaves of the grain variety compare in size to the 6 leaves of the leafy variety quite well. And then we're left with these red leaves, which are 4 leaves near just above the ear that are near ear leaf in size. They're big leaves. And if you do the math on those extra leaves, you find that it has 70% more leaf area above the ear than a grain variety. Now, why would you want leaf area above the ear? Why would that be important? Well, right back from the times that I was in graduate school, it was being talked about that our limitation in terms of yield was leaf area index, or the number of leaves per acre, and particularly leaves above the ear, because if tracking studies on grain will show you that 95% of the energy that ends up as starch in the ear comes from the leaves above the ear. So I took this as being an excellent way of increasing possibilities of having increased yield. The rest of the grain breeding industry has gone towards high plant density, or more plants per acre, in order to increase that leaf area. So this is done quite differently with a leafy. Now, in terms of that breeding, we've actually pulled the leaf area, the ear position down a little bit, and so the total leaf area increase on a per plant basis is about 40% more leaves above the, or more leaves per acre. No, 40% more leaves on an individual plant basis versus a modern grain variety. So very quickly on, we discovered that we needed to grow these at lower plant populations because they were such much bigger plants. And so even today, we continue to recommend that only 28,000 to 30,000 plants per acre be used for silage production, and that's on land that is good land, that's fertilized, is not particularly prone to drought, that sort of thing. Otherwise, you should be using lower plant populations. So this is the slide that I wanted you guys to come in so you could see, so I'll have to read it for you. And this is a calculation of leaf area. If you plant a leafy at 25,000 plants per acre, and we use this 40% more leaf area per plant, that is equivalent to planting grain variety at 35,000 plants per acre. We're recommending leafies be planted at 28,000 plants per acre. That's the second line down. We multiply that by 40% more leaf area per plant, and that would be the equivalent of planting the grain variety for silage at 39,000 plants per acre. Now, if we plant the leafy at 35,000 plants per acre, times 40% more per plant, that's the equivalent of planting the grain variety at 49,000 plants per acre. So the grain, dual-purpose grain varieties, the companies recommend that they be planted at 35,000 plants per acre. Therefore, the state trials are all run at 35,000 plants per acre. Most of the companies that we work with do not enter their leafy varieties in the state trials because of this set of circumstances. If you plant a leafy at 35,000 plants per acre, it is largely a failure in comparison. If you planted those same trials with the grain hybrids at 49,000 plants per acre, they'd have very little for ears, they'd have very spindly stalks, they would probably fall over, they'd be so spindly. If there was any drought at all, you might not get any grain on them. And so that's what the state trials is doing to our leafy varieties by planting them at 35,000 plants per acre. Now, in this day of modern age and planters, with really precision planters, they almost can't plant the plots at 35,000 plants, or they can't plant plots of leafies at 28 to 30,000 plants and plant the other ones at 35 because the planters don't allow that kind of programming. So I'll start through the characteristics that I've bred for in leafy then. Strong agronomics are rapid emergence, rapid growth in the spring, good enough stalks to stand for a long time, and root strength that allows you to harvest the crop. When we look at high total plant yield, this plant population affects quality as well as quantity, and so a grain variety has many more plants per acre, but their ears are smaller to make the competitive yield. The leafy variety, we have it with many fewer plants per acre, and therefore we've got to have a much bigger ear on it, and that gets explained in a video in a moment. What is long harvest window? Well, this little printing over here says that there's been some research done at Agriculture Canada in Ottawa, Ontario, and there's been some done at University of Wisconsin, where we've looked at the drying rate of kernels and the drying rate of plants through the silage harvest period. And the conclusion from the top study was that there was there was a 6-day advantage for the Leafys to stay within the parameters of being able to make good silage relative to moisture. And so that's what harvest window is all about. So you want the corn to be harvested at its optimal growth stage for its purpose in terms of storing and feeding. And that silage stage is as close to 65% moisture as you can get. Now, you can still get pretty good production out of things between 62 and 68% moisture. And that harvest window that will give you more time to do that is really beneficial in terms of fall harvesting conditions, in terms of equipment problems and all of that. It's the cheapest insurance you can get is having harvest window.
That's so big on these big areas that is incredible, because we cannot get everything chopped in the window that some of these hybrids are at. We had a 5-day rain event in South Dakota, and we went from 66 down to 59 during, right after that.
Yeah.
It just went boom, and your silage quality just falls apart.
Yeah, it can be raining and you can still have drops in moisture content by the time you get back into the field. That's right.
And these big, we just can't harvest enough, quick enough. It's such a tight window. This is wonderful that your 6 days means a lot.
Yeah, yeah,
It's huge.
yeah. But we'll go through a little bit more of the characteristics that allow this as we go through. So, as an addition to what he was just saying, what happens when the product is too dry? Well, it just automatically becomes less digestible. The sugars in the plant disappear as the crop gets too dry, and it is the pickling process by the lactobacillus bacteria, once it goes into the silo, is what makes the preservation during a fermentation. And so if you've got low sugar content, you've got slower fermentation, you've got less fermentation, you can run into molds, it's difficult to pack, and you end up with high dry matter losses. So the biggest component feed cost that you have is corn silage, and if it gets too dry on you, you've got a mess, because that's all you got for the next year. You don't move that stuff very far, and if it's a mess there, it's probably a mess for your neighbors as well.
But not only that, with the big dairies, and with their buying more corn silage from outside of their realm, that person selling tonnage is drastically economically hurt by low moisture silage. They're almost discounted.
Yeah.
How about the people that are complaining to me about the corn is molding in the field?
The corn is molding in the field?
Yes.
Yeah, well, that happens too. We're going to talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
I'm not like Mac. I don't want my questions during it. We'll have the questions afterwards, because I'm probably going to answer some of your questions as we go through. Short storage period. So this is something that is related to the fermentation. It's related to the quality of the silage that goes into it. Grain varieties, mostly the seed companies recommend that the product stays in the silo for 5 to 6 months before you feed it. We're saying that with Leafys, you can start to feed that product within 30 days when fermentation has finished. So part of the 3 reasons that we get a short storage period with Leafys is that they have this high sugar content in these younger leaves above the ear, and even though the stalk is drying down below the ear, the top part of the plant is still staying alive enough to have a lot of sugars in there. And so the sugars help with the fermentation. I'll go through that in a second here too. The other big difference, and the reason for keeping it in the silo for so long afterwards, is in relation to the kernel characteristics. So we have selected 4 soft, friable kernels that break up, and grain varieties are selected for hard kernels that get hard very fast as it approaches maturity. And so we found that there is just this big difference with the researchers that we've worked with, both in Hungary and in Wisconsin. For those of you who aren't familiar with fermentation, you dairy producers are familiar with this, but so you harvest the crop, the pH is at that top level is close to neutral, because pH is 7. And what we do when we chop the crop and squeeze it into the silo, whether it's an upright or a vertical silo, is we squeeze the oxygen out of it. The anaerobic bacteria that are on everything to start with, they use up the rest of the oxygen fairly fast, and then the anaerobic bacteria take over. And these are the lactobacillus that make acids from sugars. So the making of the lactic acid by lactobacillus and the other inoculated lactobacillus types that you put on the corn at harvest time, they start to increase very rapidly in this anaerobic condition, and they're converting the sugars into lactic acid. The pH drops. Over a short time, the pH gets down to 5. And what happens with the bacteria is that they increase, and then the pH gets so high that they actually kill themselves, and the product is stable. As long as you can keep the oxygen out of it, the product is stable for a very long period of time. That fermentation phase, if you've put in 65% moisture corn into it to start with, should take about 2 weeks. And then from then on, it's kind of stable. We're saying that within 30 to 45 days with Leafys, you should be starting to be able to feed this. And that's a far cry difference from 60 days, or not 60 days, 6 months that the grain hybrid people would talk about. Scared me there for a minute. So high fiber digestibility is partly achieved by the breeding and the architecture change that we have with the silage. So the grain variety, of course, is bred for late season strength and has a very large stalk below the ear, and very little of its dry matter percentage that is not ear is above the ear. The Leafy has quite a lot of above the ear product that is very flexible and soft, and very little of the below the ear product. And it's that proportion that gives us a higher starch or higher fiber digestibility with the Leafy. Now we find out if the videos work.
My old topic of flexibility in my selection for flexibility in terms of the stock. And I've always assumed that flexibility, the more flexibility, the less lignin that there was in the stock, and therefore the more digestible MDF that there would be with the stock. So this is the kind of flex that we have with the Leafy. And you'll notice, of course, that there's a lot more above the ear dry matter in this, and wet matter, than there is in the grain variety. And this is the grain hybrid, and it doesn't have that kind of flexiness to it at all. It's a much stiffer sort of plant. And it's got very little above the ear, which would be the more dead.
You can have a question if you want now. Okay. Scared you, didn't I?
Matt? Yeah, the third world solution would just be to hold the mic up to the.
That's what I was thinking.
Oh, over there?
There you go.
Adjustable part of the stuff. I want to talk about my old topic of flexibility in my selection for flexibility in terms of the stock. And I've always assumed that flexibility, the more flexibility, the less lignin that there was in the stock, and therefore the more digestible MDF that there would be with the stock. So this This is the kind of flex that we have with the Leafy. And you notice, of course, that there's a lot more above the ear dry matter in this, and wet matter, than there is in the grain variety. And this is the grain hybrid, and it doesn't have that kind of flexiness to it at all. It's much stiffer sort of plant. And it's got very little above the ear, which would be the more digestible part of the stalk. The rigidity below the ear is, I can feel it very, very differently. This is much stiffer stalk below the ear than this variety.
Okay, that's it. Thank you. So that was the high starch or high fiber digestibility that we achieved by just changing the architecture. The high starch quantity, yes, there are more plants per acre with the grain variety, and they're grown at 35,000 plants per acre. For silage, I don't know, the plant population for grain in this area is probably 33,000 plants anyway, isn't it? Or
Yeah, or more, 34.
34, okay. We know that those grain varieties produce a lot of grain. That's for absolute certain, because if they didn't, they wouldn't be on the market. Now, the Leafy variety, if we're going to grow to 28,000 plants per acre, it has to have a much bigger ear. And so we get high starch quantities in the Leafies that we have developed, and the Leafies that are on the marketplace. They have high grain yields, that's for sure. Because if you don't have high grain yields, I mean, for almost the last half of the growing season that corn grows in, it has flowered and it is just sitting there producing grain. So if that has to be, if we have a Leafy variety that doesn't have very good grain on it, that means that its maximum yield was pretty well achieved at the time, the flowering time, and so it couldn't be competitive. So this kind of is out of order. I should have had this back earlier to make it work sense. So at 28,000 plants per acre, we get a bigger stalk, we get a bigger ear. And that bigger stalk, these two are sliced through at the same 1 internode below the ear. The bigger stalk has more pith in it relative to the rind at the lower plant population than at the high plant population. And that's another thing that gives us the stalk digestibility, is that there's just more of that digestible material in a plant that's planted with a little more space than there is in one that's crowded together. The starch content will be higher at 28,000 plants per acre than it is at 35,000 plants per acre. The NDF digestibility is increased just a little bit, which is nice. And of course the yield, we almost always find that the yield maxes at some place around 30,000 with these big plants, and we get a little bit of decline. If it's a dry year, we get more decline than we get in a really good year. And we've tested this for many years now. Now we'll move to starch digestibility. So the corn was native to North America. The indigenous peoples, all the different ones, they lived on corn and had corn as part of their diet. The tribes in the north had the vitreous flint. The tribes in the south had the Floury types. So Floury types are something that's been around for a very long time. It was the European settlers, as they moved into the Midwest, that made the cross between vitreous flints, the early ones, and the Floury ones. They were mostly growing Floury types, but Floury types in cool spring conditions didn't germinate and emerge very well. And so some very clever farmers got flint types to hand plant into those spaces that there were in the field. And with open pollination, that was the birth of the dent. So kernels dent because they've got heavy vitreous starch on the outside of the kernel. They've got soft starch on the inside of the kernel, that as the moisture content goes down, that soft starch sinks. And so that's where a dent comes from. So all of our modern grain varieties have been bred towards the development of more vitreous starch. And by doing that, they had a product that could be handled intact without any flowering on it, and could be shipped long distances and arrive intact. It's been a negative with respect to digestion for everything, because you know, you have to grind to very fine content the corn for all the rest of the animals that it's fed to. It would be better to have a softer kernel texture stuff to start with, but we don't. So I've selected Leafys to go towards the more white starch in the whole operation.
This is the grain selected ear from this traded hybrid, and you'll notice that they are what is called a determinate size ear. There isn't very much of this ear that isn't filled. There's only a few initials above it that are not filled, and it's smaller dimensioned considerably than the Leafy. We're going to show them both here in a minute. If I crack them, you'll see that it's got fairly deep kernels on it, and they are at, they're just barely at 20% milk line. So this is certainly still a little bit immature for silage, but that gives you the idea of the size and the depth of the kernels on the grain variety. So this is the GD4 by GL62, and you can see that there's a considerably larger ear. You'll also notice that the amount that isn't filled at the end, this is a flex ear type, so when it gets a space, it fills more of that end of the ear, and you get even higher grain content in the silage. And I will crack this one now, so that you can see it has not as deep a kernel as the grain hybrid, but is still fairly deep. And you'll notice that the kernels are large and flat in comparison, and this is what makes them so susceptible. This is partly what makes them so susceptible to breakage in the silage harvest stage. The test weight on this Leafy, if taken to maturity, which it won't do because it'll be used for silage, but if taken to maturity, the test weight on this would be a 52, 53 pounds per bushel test weight. They are lighter test weight kernels, and particularly because this is a Floury Leafy. This one, the fully traded grain hybrid, would probably have a bushel weight 58 to 60 pounds. So it's a more dense product with the more vitreous seed in there, and that starch is packed in more tightly, and that's what gives it the weight in terms of what you call test weight. This is light. The reason we want this to be light is that we want these kernels to be breakable. We want them to break up in the silage harvest system and to be digestible with the acids in the silo, and to be digestible with the cows chewing and with the rumen bacteria, that these smaller broken up pieces of lighter starch material are more readily attacked, have more sites of digestion on them than the large harder pieces that would come from a grain hybrid that's used for silage.
So if we look at a Leafy that's been, the ear has been shaved off, you'll see that there's a lot of white starch inside the individual kernels, and that white starch means that when they go through the processing system, it breaks up much more easily. Starch digestibility is important because it is rumen available starch that makes milk. Starch that is digested in the other stomachs and into the hind gut goes for maintenance, which is her ability to walk around, make heat, grow another calf, and body conditioning score, which is the ability to put on a little bit of meat or a little bit of fat while she's in later lactation. But the rumen available starch is what makes milk, and it's the digestion by the rumen bacteria that makes milk, that the cow lives on that. And if kernels pass through in the manure, of course, they're just a dead loss. There's no value to kernels in the manure. They just represent a complete loss of feed value. Ration type availability, adaptability with the leafies, or with any corn silage thing, and I touched on this already. You have dry cows, you have heifers, you have early lactation cows, mid lactation cows, and late lactation cows, and you would balance the rations a little bit differently for each of those. If you're in a size of an operation where you can split up the rations, you would do that. It has excellent feed quality because of this small particle size in the starch. There are more sites of digestion. Because of the increased surface area, you imagine that when you put fine powder in with a whole bunch of little bugs, they all get a chance to get quite a lot of that fine powder in fairly fast, whereas if you throw in a bowling ball, there isn't very many of them that can get on the surface of the bowling ball, so particle size is just extremely important. Also, with this lighter corn and the smaller particle size, it seems to float in the rumen a little bit higher into what's called the rumen mat. And that helps to retain it in the rumen longer so that the bacteria have more chance to eat it up and then produce the feed that the cow will live on. And with leafies, we've got this balance of effective and digestible fiber. So the cow has to have enough fiber that isn't digestible in order to make her entire digestive system work and maintain her health. And it's necessary to have digestible fiber as well. So I discovered, in our breeding work, we discovered an inbred line that was starting to segregate on the ear for kernels that were completely floury inside. They had a very, very thin layer of outside starch or outside vitreous starch on them. And this was 18 years ago that I discovered this, and we brought it to the marketplace now. We eventually discovered through crossing work that what we had was a known gene that was called opaque 1. So this depiction, the kernels that make it the O in the middle of this are ones which do not allow light to come through them. They are opaque. The other kernels are vitreous, and so vitreous means glass, and they're glass-like. They let light come through them. So this is opaque 1, and that's what our floury is. If we shave off the kernels just with a knife or a grinder, you see that you will see kernels on there that have the little bit of white on the inside and a lot of vitreous, and then you see the kernels that are completely white inside with very little of the vitreous on them. If those kernels are cut in half, you see they're completely white on the inside. So they're a little bit yellow on the outside, but it's a kind of a creamy yellow. You can tell them immediately, you can see them. Another video.
I'll explain the genetics of the leafy flowery hybrids in the market. So flowery is uniform in one of the parents of the cross. Leafy is uniform in the other parent of the cross. The cross between the two gives us leafy flowery seed. These leafy flowery seeds, when planted in the farmer's field, make leafy flowery hybrid plants that have to undergo sexual meiosis in order to set seed on the ear. Meiosis gives the division of the floury, which is recessive, and the leafy, which is dominant. So 25% of the kernels that are set on the ear are full floury. The other 75% are like our other leafy hybrids in that they have a high proportion of the kernel that is floury.
So the important part of this is the small particle size. I've already gone over that quite a bit. The longer rumen retention. This is what adds together to make that starch more high energy starch, something that's more rapidly digestible in the rumen and more of it digested in the rumen. It has ration type adaptability. when we're actually feeding this to cows, we're feeding less concentrate corn because the corn that's in the silage is more digestible, but you can balance any ration with this product. And we know from studies and from customers that are using it that the milk fat concentration usually goes up by a quarter to 0.5%, and so that's what means high quality milk or a higher price for your milk. We absolutely tell people when acidosis is a problem that dairy farmers have when they start feeding too high an energy content in a ration. So we tell people to when they move to the ration to reduce their concentrate corn in the TMR, the total mixed ration, because they can expect that there will be 10 to 12 percentage points increased starch digestion with this leafy floury material.
This demonstration compares two dry grain samples to illustrate some of the inherent differences between the hard vitreous kernels that are bred for grain and leafy floury kernels that are bred for higher starch digestibility. Both samples will be ground at the same grinder setting. The kernels of the grain hybrid produce a meal which has a lot of hard vitreous pieces in it and some floury starch in there. It is well known now by nutritional scientists that the smaller and finer the particles of starch can be made, the more rapidly they become digestible in the silo and the more rapidly that they can be digested in the cow. The floury leafy produces a product that has considerably more of the floury pieces and very small pieces of the vitreous stuff.
So there are some recommendations that we have when you're growing floury leafies, and you stay with the same plant population. One of the things that we're saying is you should try to get some isolation. So because it's a recessive gene, it must pollinate itself in order to get that 25% kernel proportion. And if you keep it at a little bit of a distance from any normal corn, that will help a lot to maintain that. If you can't maintain a distance, then you should keep the floury leafy on the west side so that the predominant wind will not blow pollen into it, but it will blow pollen into the other. It won't hurt the other crop in terms of what it does for it because it's a recessive gene, but much better to do it that way than to put it, say, in a north-south long section, put it into a block. So the recommendations are that we keep the same plant population as we had with the grain variety. You should never, ever, ever mix a leafy or a floury leafy in a field with any other hybrid. All you're doing is making a terrible decision in relation to being able to feed that product because you cannot match them. You're far better off to keep them separate in the field and keep them separate in terms of harvest as well. You will not be harvesting your leafy acres for grain. If you take this floury stuff to the mill, there's two things that will happen. You'll be docked for broken kernels and you'll be docked for moisture content. You could, however, harvest it for high moisture corn if you have capability of putting it either in a bag or into a silo for high moisture corn. You should reduce the concentrate corn in the ration because you don't want the cows to get acidotic. Some really recent research with very high starch digestibility corn has shown us that with a bit of time involved in the changeover of the ration, that there are protozoa fraction rather than the bacterial fraction in the rumen microorganism populations increases. And those stop, those ones are heavy starch eaters, and they can stop the drop in pH in the ration, so or in the rumen, and so we actually could increase milk production further, but you have to do that on a sliding scale. So right at the beginning, at a changeover to a floury leafy ration, reduce the concentrate corn by 2-3 pounds a day, and then let that population change somewhat, and then start bringing it back up, and the cows should milk more. We've got lots of experience that that's happening now. This last point about silage tests will not accurately measure starch content or starch digestibility. So almost all of the silage tests that anybody does don't look at starch digestibility at all. They just look at starch content. And there's some talk in the popular press right now. Pioneer people are writing articles that will say that there's some confusion about starch, and it just starch is starch, and you should always look for the highest starch that you can get in the ration. But starch isn't starch. Starch can be much more digestible. But the current main test that's done for digestibility for all silage samples is something that's called the Milk 2006 formula. And it is a near-infrared reflectance formula, an NIR test, and it was developed on the basis of all the vitreous hybrids that were in there. When we put a floury leafy rather, into one of these tests, it invariably comes back as being lower in starch than we know it is, because we saw those big ears in the product. And the reason is because the light system in an NIR does not recognize this small particle, very white material that gets widely dispersed in the silage, and we're getting a very bad underestimation of it. This afternoon I'm going to visit with Dairyland Labs over in Arcadia, Wisconsin, and we're doing research work with them. They haven't been able so far to spend much time talking about starch digestibility, because there was only the dual-purpose hybrids available in large quantities for farmers to start with. And even our leafies had better starch digestibility, but nobody was looking at it. Now that we've got floury, they recognize that there are some major differences, and they're much more willing to look at it now. So over the next several years, we're going to be able to develop better starch digestion techniques.
Sir, have you ever talked to Dr. Charles Berger about that?
Say again?
Dr. Charles Berger?
No.
Have you ever talked to him about that?
No.
He was the innovator, he was the originator of most of the NIR testing in grain. And you might want to visit with him.
And what?
You might want to visit with him about that. He did most of the calibration for most of these NIR that you out.
Yeah, and so it's pretty easy to do calibrations for NIR with grain, because grain is a very uniform product. When you send in silage, it's a mixture of grain and forage, and as it changes in moisture content at harvest time, it becomes a very different mixture of grain and forage, and it's another whole level of difficulty for doing that. So there is excellent NIR work that's being done by a lot of people at a lot of different labs, but we're just now starting to get them to work on starch digestibility. So it's all been done on starch content almost exclusively.
Wouldn't wet chemistry be a better test in this situation?
Wet chemistry should be a better test in this situation. The wet chemistry tests that we've witnessed and been looking at so far, what happens is the sample goes to the lab. The lab dries the sample very rapidly, so that they have it as a dry matter basis, so that they can take a very small amount of it and be sure how much they've got of it. They grind it through a 1 millimeter grind, so they grind it very fine. So two things that relate to that test. The first is that the drying temperature, when it's done very fast, they're essentially cooking the corn, and it has very little effect on the vitreous corn, but it actually changes some of the flour into crystallized form, which then is not digestible in the in vitro test that's done afterwards. So that's number one problem. The number two problem is this size of grind. So if you take a vitreous, and what we're looking for is the relative difference, so that we could, for me, so I can select on that basis, and for a dairy farmer, so that he can balance a ration on that basis. But the relative difference between the vitreous type and the floury type is what you're looking for, so that you can predict a ration. So when you grind it through a 1 millimeter grind, you're grinding the vitreous one to a much finer product size than it would ever be presented to the cow in. So you're actually making its or starch digestibility appear higher. And when you grind the other one, the floury, it makes a very, very much finer grind, but the two of them come together on it. So part of what we're doing with these labs in terms of discussion is, how do we handle the sample without drying it? Or let's dry part of it so we know what the dry matter determination is, so that we can correct for dry matter determination. And let's grind it through a different screen size, so maybe 3 millimeters, maybe 4 millimeters. The other area that we're working on is the time. So most of the starch digestibility work is done as 7-hour starch. Nobody knows why 7-hour starch was figured out in the first place. And the people that are really looking at time in the rumen and bug multiplication and everything are saying maybe it makes sense to be at a 4 or 5-hour starch to really pick up the differences in these things. So it truly is an area where they're just now starting to look at it. And I was at a conference 2 years ago, all of the nutritionists from pretty well North America and most of them from Europe that are working as research nutritionists. And there still was just starch is starch. The conference was on starch, and nobody was talking about the huge digestibility differences that there could be on starch. So we're getting this started, but it's just starting, yeah. I brought BMR into this table here. This is our ideal silage characteristics, and then how they work with Leafy, Floury, BMR, and dual purpose. And so we went through the dual purpose as it not having, there's various ones of these. The things that BMR do not have is strong agronomics, and it does not have high total plant yield. It again doesn't, the same as the grain variety, it doesn't have a long harvest window. There's still the hard kernels on the wet stalk. It doesn't have the short storage period. They still recommend that it be in the silo for 4 to 6 months. It certainly has excellent feed quality because of its extra high fiber digestibility, and it doesn't have high starch digestibility. So with Leafy...
Why would you say that it has high starch content?
Well, it has relative to the amount of the other one. I'm not talking about per acre the total gross starch. I'm talking about the percentage of starch relative to the amount of fiber that it's got in it. So okay, if it yields 15% less than the other,
Right.
within the crop that you've got, you can still have high starch content of the feed. So once it leaves the field and a nutritionist starts to look at it, he's only interested in how do I balance that to make feed. And so it does have high starch content.
Dr. Glenn, I'm not sure that everybody knows what BMR is, so maybe it's just...
Oh, well, that's another whole story then. So the two dairy guys that are in here know what BMR is, I'm sure. So it's a gene called brown midrib. So The rib in the center of the leaves on the back side, if you look at it, it's a brownish color rather than the green color. And brown midrib is linked with low lignin content in the stalk fibers, and the fibers don't have cross linkages. So without those cross linkages, they don't have stalk integrity, and so there's really one of the big problems is that the stuff falls over before you can harvest it many times. But it does feed very, very well. The cows can eat more of it because it goes through the rate of passage on it is higher. The other problem with brown midrib is that it absolutely has to have some longer fiber, low digestibility fiber mixed in the ration because it does go through too fast. So you have to slow it down, and so you have to mix it in. Was that good enough? Yeah. So there are a number of ways that you can, oh, I went the wrong way. Okay. So we've got these 10 ways to boost your bottom line. And these are all on our website and you can look at them. But the first one is that you are planting less seed. So you're planting 20% less seed and there's a saving on seed. Number two is you take no hit on tonnage because you maximize tonnage. We have, if anything, we have higher tonnage than any dual purpose that there is out there. The importance of harvest window we've talked about. My daughter Margot has paid less for custom chopping in here because the guys don't use as much horsepower because it cuts so much easier and they don't have to screw down the processor so hard to try to get kernel breakage on it. But I don't think you'll get anybody to charge you less for custom chopping.
What is your recommendation for that processing? So you at the proper moisture, would you process?
I think it's still worthwhile to do some processing. You do not have to do processing where you're really lugging that machine down so hard. Okay. You know, you don't need to wear out your rolls in 1,000 acres. You can probably do 4,000 acres on the rolls, that sort of thing. The reduction in storage space by about 25%, that's really what it works out to when you compare that you can start feeding in 30 days versus you can start feeding in something like 150 days. There's a big difference. And that relates to number 6, which is minimize your dry matter losses. The longer it stays in the silo, the more dry matter losses that there are. Number 7 is reduce kernel passage and sorting. So when that starch is very fine particle size and is spread all over everything, the cows eat everything. They don't worry about it. We've always had good palatability with Leafys because of this extra sugars in there and the fresh fermentation that you get with the lactic acids on there. You can reduce additives, and the main additive you can reduce, of course, is either high moisture corn or finely ground grain corn. All of the studies that we've done so far and a lot of dairies that we've worked with, they're getting higher milk urea nitrogen levels with the Leafys. That's an indicator that we've got higher soluble protein in it. So I think that we can reduce some of the protein sources as well with feeding these leafy flowers. You can enjoy high milk production, and then I talked before about increasing the milk fat concentration with feeding Floury Leafys, and that's for sure. Oh, punched it wrong again. This is one testimonial from some neighbors of ours, or people that are close to us in southern Ontario. They have a small herd, 75 cows. They have been feeding, growing and feeding a Floury Leafy for 4 seasons. They say their milk production is right where they want it to be at an average of 32 liters per day with 3.87% fat, and their herd is healthy and fertile. Laura, the partner in this operation, she balanced rations for a mineral supply company for a number of years. And so she works with the veterinarian as well in order to balance the ration. And she says that our cows produce and watching the manure is one of the important things in terms of balancing a ration. She says our cows produce consistent manure that is not too runny, not too firm, and with no visible kernel passage, and that smells like money. And then in the crop that they produced this year we're kind of a little bit lower in heat units, later harvest than normal by quite a bit, and the guys that did the custom chopping for them, they said that their crop was at a great stage of maturity. Many of the other crops that they had harvested, the kernels were already getting very dry, and yet the stalks were so wet that they had moisture running out of the bottom of the chopper. And they said in this one there was no juice running behind the chopper, and the ears were just huge. Anyway.
Would you start chopping sooner or later with this 109-day number compared to a 109-day conventional? How does it mature in the fall?
Well, it will come to the silage harvest stage at about the same time, but it'll stay in that silage harvest stage longer. Yeah, good question. So we got lots of time for questions here.
Sure. Dr. Glenn, can you talk a little, so since the dairy labs themselves are for the most part unable to show the advantage of the feed, how do you convince the farmers that in fact this is better feed? Is it all on-farm studies, or how do you?
We've been able to convince people by this reasoning to start with, to the point that they will try it, and they will have some separate storage of it so that they actually can try it, and they find that it is in fact real, and it works. It would be much nicer if you could have a lab test to do that, and I mean this is the biggest encumbrance to our getting more things out there, because it sounds to most people like it's just a story, and it's you know, if you've got all the lab tests backing up the other stuff, then the other stuff must be better. Well, it isn't the case. It's the other way around, but unfortunately it's going to take a few more years to get these lab tests straightened around until we can show that.
Do you have any university trials where they're showing a control group and a group with the Floury and a group with conventional and those kind of studies, or not yet?
We have one study that we did at University of Wisconsin that was with the Floury Leafy in comparison to a mycogen BMR, and in comparison to a hybrid, which we're not allowed to say whose it was. And the harvest window was the first thing that played into the study, because what happened was that the company's variety that I can't talk about, it crashed and burned later in the season, and when the other two were coming off at 65-68%, it had already dropped through that phase really quickly and became 55%. So it was excluded from the study. So it became a study of Floury Leafy versus BMR. And when I started into the study, I had always assumed that what a dairy farmer would do would be to take a test, develop a ration, watch how it fed, adjust the ration, and go on from there. Well, I found out halfway through the study that they had developed the ration for the BMR, and they had put straw in the ration. So we got a Leafy that's got all this effective fiber in it, and we put straw in the ration, so we limited intake to start with. So the BMR won the study in terms of milk production and feed intake. The Floury Leafy had a higher percent, it had this higher milk nitrogen value on it, but it had higher fat with the Floury Leafy, and it had exactly the same feed efficiency as the BMR did. So ultimately it produced as much milk, and it produced as efficiently, and it produced a higher fat content milk, but the BMR produced more milk within the time period.
The dry matter intake of the corn silage was the same on each group.
No, it was the dry matter intake was higher with the BMR because they put straw in the ration with the Floury Leafy. So that stopped me from paying $65,000 every time you do a test.
Sounds to me like you didn't pay enough to get them on your side.
Well,
It was more of a BMR trial than it was.
well, it was, yeah.
Yeah.
In many ways, it was. And if they had balanced the ration for the Floury Leafy, then the BMR would have had huge intakes because there wouldn't be any.
You should have had another replication. You can only do, you gotta do, you can't, I mean.
Yeah, well, scientific studies I found out are only publishable if there's only one variable in them. And the variable could only be the variety, so therefore the two rations had to be the same.
Right.
Stupid, eh? So anyway, that's why I'm not doing any more until we get the tests figured out, and then we can work beyond that. Over there.
Does this Floury variety work the same in early as it does in chop silage?
Yes.
Then you got the same advantages?
Well, we've got so few people that are making earlage with it yet. And we have had people that have harvested in years when there was good yields and they had extra Floury Leafy left over. They have harvested it and put it in a bag. A couple have put it into blue silos and have fed it, and it feeds tremendously well, yeah. So they greatly reduce the amount of corn they're feeding the cows while maintaining high milk production.
Have you used Rock River's total track digestibility?
So, the question was, have we used Rock River's total tract digestibility, which is Dave Merton's new trial. And we haven't, because total tract digestibility is only important for. In my breeding work, I've wanted to get everything in relation to rumen digestibility. So I've been trying to work with the labs to work on rumen digestibility. Total tract digestibility is important, but it isn't near as important for milk production as rumen digestibility. That answer, sort of?
I work with the fertility silages and so forth, and we get people that have, the corn is molding in the field before it's ever chopped.
Yeah, so.
Wouldn't that be more indicative to your hybrid versus a Plenty, which is a harder shell, so therefore you would have the possibility of more mycotoxins in field?
The opposite is true.
Really?
But the opposite is only true on my material because I've worked so hard to make it, to not advance molded lines. So these Flouries, and we're testing them for grain now too, because we're looking for this high moisture corn situation. And they have much less mold than almost any of the commercial varieties that are on the market. But that's because I paid such detailed attention in the selection of the inbred lines for mold. The other aspect in terms of the breeding work is that by keeping the plant population low, we get ears that are large that open up the end of the husks a little bit. And almost all of the moldy types occur at high plant population where you get this long silk channel over top of the end of the ear, and that's where the mold starts in there, and it grows and makes stuff that eventually turns into toxins. So with these varieties, you can expect a real cure for a lot of that, but grow them at the low population, for sure.
But the initial issue with European, that's why they were so flinty, is because they had more molds, from my understanding, and in the United States traditionally haven't had that much mold in their corn, so they were more flowery from the get-go, but they were
Yeah, so, but you're going all the way back to thinking of the days when it was corn crib storage, eh?
could be.
Yeah, so in corn crib storage, and if you've got softer kernel textures and just a little bit of handling and nicking in them and that sort of thing, and you got the part for infection,
So
and
that
the
would
Europeans
be
would do.
storage mold versus field mold.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you have any experience with soil fertility versus mold?
My only experience in that and relates to where we've had yield trials on heavily applied hog manure afterwards, or prior to planting, and I know that we had more mold in that year than anything else I had ever seen, where there was a really heavy application of hog manure, hog slurry.
Or dairy.
Well,
It wouldn't make any difference, be dairy or beef.
yeah, it could be dairy or beef. Yeah.
But the calcium level, that's what prevents mold. And if you get into the area of fertility, also affects what you're looking at.
Yeah, so you're saying that you want your soil pH to be close to neutral. You don't want acid soils to be growing it on.
You don't do it with pH test either, you gotta do it with a calcium test.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's cation exchange stuff and calcium. All right.
Calcium is different.
Okay.
Thank you.
Dr. Glenn, could you address, just state that these are all non-GMO and the efforts you make to keep that?
Yeah. Okay. So the breeding work that we do is without traits on them, and we are in an area where there's a lot of traded corn in the general population of acres of corn. In our production area, and we're in this production area because we were able to get small plot isolations for multiplication of parent seed. In the other crops that are grown by the farmers that I work with are apples, pears, peaches, tomatoes, melons. They grow some soybeans. Our neighbors beyond that, there's a golf course on one side of us. It's all wheat belt behind us. It's only ever wheat and soybeans. And we've got a couple of farmers on the east side of us, but that's the predominant winds are not from the east. So we do some business in Europe, and we do business in New Zealand, and so we're very interested in having non-GMO corn, and so we're striving very hard to have non-GMO corn. There are Leafy traded varieties on the marketplace, so we have a program where we work with Monsanto on Roundup and Smart Stacks varieties, and so we do that. We do that in a separate nursery, that it's away from our other things. We do that in terms of our isolations in the field. We have all of our Roundup Ready and other traded things are on the east side of anything else, and we isolate by a further distance from the traits because we're really wanting to keep the things GMO free.
What's the bromelain and the?
One guy way back there.
Do you have any insight or preferences on row width with
So I don't. We've got a guy in the question is row widths in corn. So we do all our testing in 30-inch rows. We've got a customer who's going to plant it in 12-inch rows starting this year. And he's wondering about bringing the plant population up higher, and what do you bring it to? And I don't know the answer to that, because if you go 12 by 12, that's a square foot, and that would mean 43,000 plants per acre just at 12 by 12. And I don't know whether that's too high or not. So I don't know the answer to that. I mean, years ago we planted in 38-inch rows, and now we're in 30s because that was the way the industry went. I like 30s.
What have your work been doing, any work been doing on bromelain and xylene and some of those to release that starch? Is that less in this product, do you think?
It's a funny deal on prolamins. Prolamins are the proteins into which the starch granules are accumulated to form the storage organs in the kernels. And a guy named Pat Hoffman in Wisconsin worked on prolamin contents, saying that the higher prolamin content, which is actually a protein that the starch is packed into, then the less digestibility that there would be. Then he tested some of our corn, which is really digestible, and he found that it had higher prolamin contents than vitreous. So it just meant that prolamin was not the answer. You're wanting to move this along, aren't you?
No, I mean, we have plenty of time, so
Okay.
if there's more questions, we can
Do you think, what's your opinion on flex here, double layer variety?
Well, that's what we breed for, because if you have any emergence problems or anything, you want that plant to be able to take up the capability of doing it, then you want a flexier type on there.
So we should be pushing for that third year to be the throttle and the brake on that?
I don't know about the third year, but certainly the second year, yeah. I wouldn't suggest that we should go to such a low plant population that we would need to look towards a third year to capture starch. I think we should be working at a high enough population so that we got one good year, and if there's a space there, it's got partly of a pretty decent second year to do that.
With all the great testimonials you've had, and I've heard many great testimonials over the year on nutritional value of milk, meat, and eggs, how come it's taken this long for that, in your opinion, to have light, that the animals are responding to these complete proteins? I'm a big fan of Don Huber, and he talks about complete proteins and incomplete proteins. You buy into that or avoid that?
I don't really, because the digestion, the digestive systems, if animals in the wild will eat what they need to get growth and protein. What we're doing in agriculture is trying to accelerate that growth as much as we can and as rapidly as possible as time as we can, but we can probably do it more efficiently with proteins. They do not have to be absolutely complete proteins in order to have nutrition and health in the animal and growth. His opinion, my opinion, is yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're supplementing with methionine all the time. And do we need to? Economically, I don't. For milk production, we're bringing methionine, extra methionine in, and I don't know whether we really even need to. I think we're probably feeding a higher level of protein than we need to all of the animals that we're feeding. But I mean, they're all kind of testimonial stuff, because there aren't really good feeding studies that determine those things.
Yeah, but the mud and the bun show that all the time.
Say again?
The mud and the bun show that all the time.
Yeah, when you have the high mun, yeah. Yeah.
Look at most of the tests are high.
Yeah, and what does an animal have to do with high protein? It has to degrade it through the kidneys in order to liver and kidneys in order to get rid of it. And wouldn't it be better to be feeding her a little less protein to start with and not having to pay that extra money for the protein, and still getting the milk value, and still getting the fat value, and maybe getting an animal that was healthier and lasted a little bit longer? Okay, I think we